Welcome everybody to China in 5 Cities, a book launch by Professor Kerry Brown in conversation with the Lao Chair of Chinese International Relations, Professor Astrid Nordin. Welcome everybody to China in 5 Cities, a book launch by Professor Kerry Brown in conversation with the Lao Chair of Chinese International Relations, Professor Astrid Nordin. Welcome everybody to China in 5 Cities, a book launch. Thank you. I didn't really want to relive that moment. Just streaming this, so there may be a couple of technical difficulties, but we'll get that sorted out. Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, which I'm sure is not many, Kerry Brown is one of the world's renowned China scholars, and he assures me that he's written more books than he's read, which I do believe. I think his latest count's about 100, is that right? Or I think it's about 22. So thank you so much for being here to launch this latest book. We will have a book signing and the book for sale after this event, just in the adjoining room. And our online participants will be able to send you a link as well. So before we get started, just to let you know the format, we're going to have Astrid and Kerry in conversation, and there will be time for audience Q&A. So make sure you have your questions ready. That goes for the online audience as well. Please pop your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and we can read those out for you. Welcome to another China Week event. This is day 2 of China Week, and there's plenty more events throughout the week. So have a look at the program that's around the room and also online. And thank you all for coming. And I'll now hand over to Professor Astrid Nordin.
Thank you very much, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's nice to see this room really fully packed. Clearly, Kerry's book is a draw. Many people want to find out about him and his views on China and his life there. So we're going to have a little chat about the book and about living in China. For full disclosure, I too am somebody who's marked by many of the cities that Kerry has written about. He's spends 2 of the chapters in this book talking about Beijing and Hong Kong, which have both been home to me as I have also grown as a person and a scholar, trying to know something about China. Before we launch into our chat about its contents, I'll read out to you the little blurb from the book, which reads like this. Kerry Brown began his life in the 1990s China almost by chance, cutting his teeth in its northern backwaters. He went on to become a British diplomat in Beijing and then one of the world's foremost sinologists with at least 100 books. Since then, the Middle Kingdom has transformed from backwater to emergent superpower, to fanfare, scrutiny, and a tidal wave of think pieces. Offering a light alternative to the bluster, the Kentish academic draws on wit, allusion, and anecdotes of adventure to render the People's Republic knowable to Western readers, and in so doing, humanize its monumental ascent. And I thought maybe we could start our conversation with that last bit, Kerry, about making China knowable and the kind of the positioning as a Westerner. To that, because a lot of your book, as I read it, is about working through your own feelings about and ways of engaging with China as somebody who at least starts off considering himself as an outsider. And you write about a kind of impulse of knowing China, but also about you kind of accuse yourself of harboring some kind of Orientalist impulse in doing so, in casting China as other to yourself and working through that through your life in China. So I was wondering if you could start off maybe about telling us a little bit about this aspect and this struggle.
Look, thank you. Thanks everyone too for coming, and I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to go back to in-person meetings. This kind of book was proposed by a Chinese publisher, and my first objective was to write about China without writing about Chinese politics, and to write apolitically, because I thought everything that I'd read and thought about was usually very political about China. I mean, I don't mean political in the sense of, making any kind of judgment, but it was very sensitive and attentive to the fact that China is a very political issue, the People's Republic of China. But actually there are whole aspects of China as a culture, as a geography, as a place of human living, which of course are not political. So that was the first objective. The second objective was to make sure that it wasn't particularly personal. I didn't want to write, a kind of autobiography. I can't see the point in that. I thought, well, what would it be to try and describe the kind of this enigmatic moment when everyone, presumably most people here, have been to either China or Hong Kong or Taiwan or Asia generally, or any place that isn't where we're from. What sort of experience is that when you arrive and you're smelling things and seeing things and hearing things? I mean, it's very sort of tangible. And what makes that? How do you describe that? How do you give that kind of meaning? And what are the stories that you generate from that? And so these 5 places were ones which I had spent enough of a time in that I could compare the initial moment of arriving there with a lot of sort of experiences since, over nearly 30 years, some of them, and how they, as places I kind of just had sensory experience the smells, sights, hear things, how I made stories. Because to me, I guess, I presume everyone who goes to China who's maybe not originally from China is in the business of making a story about what they're kind of experiencing when they're there. If only to justify them being there, because it's a big business to go there. I mean, it's not easy to get there. And I was just really interested in what way that story about the country then fragmented into these very different places. Hong Kong, Huahao, Beijing, Shanghai, and then Xi'an. I mean, they're all very, very different. So that was the real impetus, to sort of write apolitically, or not politically. I mean, not to sort of really try and mention China as a political place, and to write about what it is to be experiencing a place just through your 5 senses. And, although history and other things, of course, come into that, how do you make a kind of story for yourself out of that very basic presence in a place?
And so how do you think that this question of Orientalism or otherness played into that process for you? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, I mean, the fact that it's different. I mean, of course, when you go into this environment as you're from anywhere else, it is different. How do you interpret that? What sense do you make of that? And of course, you bring, as you well know, Astrid, through your work, so many different things from your own cultural, intellectual, kind of personal background, that you have to sort of take a position on what sense you make of that, the very fact that it's different. I mean, are you kind of very nonchalant about it? Do you think, okay, everywhere's different. If I even go to the next town, the next village, whatever, it's different in my home place, so that's no big deal? Or do you kind of make it more dramatic? And do you make it dramatic because you like drama, or because it is very dramatic? The sort of way of dealing with difference, particularly in China, because of political issues, historic issues, the issues between the UK and China, the issues between Europe and China, a whole bunch of things mean that the ways in which you articulate difference and kind of, sort of put this difference in front of yourself is important. Now, Orientalism is, you know, a great kind of war ground. And I suppose one of the reasons is that it's often been about Europeans in particular, not just Europeans, but others, maybe suspicious and accusing themselves of why do they have the attitudes they do to the place they're going to, particularly China in my case, but it could be any other place that's very, very different. And so I sort of felt I wanted to kind of deal with that. At the moment, the work I'm doing on is European perceptions about China over the last 500 years. And there, of course, the idea of China being different, but sometimes for certain people being different for good reasons, you know, the sort of idealistic reasons, and for others for very negative reasons, is absolutely the forefront. And I guess as a European or British European, I have to sort of, you know, you have to take a position on that and deal with that. But the quicker you get it out of the way, I think the better.
Well, I think you deal with this question quite sensitively and interestingly in your book. And you, in one passage in particular that I enjoyed, you write about the role of the kind of the Chinese sense of self as something that is a lot more malleable, perhaps, and a space for growth and development. And you talk about how on some traditional understandings, anybody can kind of, there's an equality in that anybody can grow into being a gentleman, for example. And it made me think of one of our contemporary thinkers, Yu, who talks about Chineseness. And he suggests that anybody can, in fact, become Chinese and have this Chineseness. And so I was wondering, almost in your writing, when you write about Beijing, for example, having become now part of you and who you are, have you in fact become Chinese?
Well, I remember having an animated discussion in Hainan over hot pot with a Chinese business person, where at one point when we were disagreeing about something, I said that I was more Chinese than him. And he nearly tipped a hot pot over my head. But I mean, I think you kind of, to sort of go to the very, you know, the excellent remarks you made yesterday, Astrid, you know, kind of in the opening event. I mean, I guess it's very attractive for someone from a Northern European background to see how relationships work in China. I think it's, because it seems to me that when you go there, you've got to work out quite quickly a map of who's kind of be useful and who's not. I mean, it's not as transactional as that, but when I lived in Huahalta in the mid 1990s, you know, I mean, there were often bureaucratic issues of, you know, just getting train tickets. I mean, people always think it's very strange now, you know, getting train tickets was like the biggest achievement. I remember like spending a week basking in joy because I got a ticket to Beijing, you know, and this was my big achievement for the week, because there were no ways of getting them on computer, of course, and it was very hard. And there was a person in the town who was friends with the director of the ticket office, and they were like God, you know, I mean, they really were an important person. And, you know, that's a very trivial example, but I think it makes you kind of very aware of a whole kind of bunch of things going on in the society around you, where you're in a privileged position because you're not part of it particularly. I mean, you're not really part of it because in the end, well, in my case, you go, I mean, you leave. But you sort of have to sort of play this game up to a point. But it can become obsessive. I mean, I remember people at that time in the 1990s were just obsessed by how do you make guanxi, you know, connections. And, you know, it was like you'd meet these business people sometimes, not necessarily always business people, and they would always go on about how they were the best friend of Deng Xiaoping's sisters, aunts, brothers, you know, third person removed or whatever's cat's owner. And you'd kind of be playing this game all the time. I suppose it must be different now. I mean, I'd be interested to hear, you know, my lived experience in China has been more sporadic since the mid 2000s. I mean, I've been often, I've maintained good contact, but of course, over the last 18 months, it's not been regular at all. I've not been able to go there, like, you know, many people. And I sort of wonder, I mean, I believe under Xi Jinping, it's about, you get rid of these, you know, sort of informal contacts and, you know, you're going to have more regularity. It's going to become more like you know, sort of, I suppose, a developed Western society where the people with the label do the things. It's not about finding sort of secret sources of help. But I think that's good in some ways, but in another way, it loses some of its utility. I wouldn't say mystique, because I know I really will get accused of Orientalism, but you know, some of it's sort of drama, it's narrative. That's the right word.
So bringing it into that question of today and that change over time, I was curious to hear about how you think that these issues that you've just commented on have changed in that wonderful period of time that you have been engaging with China, not just because of how China has changed you and you have perhaps changed China, but because perhaps the world around us has changed. Our understanding of China's role in that world have changed. So could you comment perhaps on the differences that you see between when you first started engaging with China and when you do so now? What stands out to you as perhaps different in the way that you are able to engage with China today?
Yeah, I mean, on a very mundane and sort of physical level, you know, the appearance of these cities is so different. I mean, Huahalta in Inner Mongolia in the mid-90s was a very sleepy provincial city with an old city at the center of it, which had temples and tombstone makers. And, you know, kind of had a sort of static quality. And I went back maybe 10 years later in the mid-2000s, and everything had changed. It's very rare, you know, you go to places that change dramatically everywhere. And I mean, usually you can orientate yourself a bit. And that particular city over that period had literally been rebuilt. I mean, even the past had been rebuilt. I mean, these old temples had been rebuilt as old temples. I mean, quite incredible. And I think other cities, Beijing and Shanghai, have changed dramatically. I mean, Shanghai with Pudong is completely unrecognizable to what existed 30 years ago, but maybe not as kind of comprehensively. I mean, not the whole city. There's been, you know, the Bund along the kind of Huangpu River is sort of roughly stayed the same. So that physical change is really, really striking. But I remember about 12 years ago, maybe less, 10 years ago, being part of a delegation to meet Liu Yunshan. I don't know if people remember him. He was the head of propaganda. This was something that David Schamberger, American academic, had arranged. And well, you often, I mean, you kind of go to these formal meetings as a diplomat. I did it. And then afterwards, you sometimes get dragged into these. And they're sort of always, you know, they're very dramatic and they're all kind of, you know, you make a few comments and then you get an hour and a half of wisdom back. And one thing that this particular leader said, he was a member of the Politburo, so very, very senior, that in China since the sort of late 70s, there'd been constant change. I mean, the place has been infected and pervaded by change. I think no one can dispute that, physically and in economic terms, socially too. But he said, what we don't know as politicians, and no one knows, is the changes in the inner life, in people's hearts. I don't know whether politicians in China now would admit that, but there seemed a kind of way in which you could track physical change very easily. But the actual sort of psychological change, the deep China, what people call deep China, how do you sort of keep an eye on that? And that's really through relationships and friendships. And I think the change has been dramatic, but no one really academically or even, you know, in fictional guise has managed to really capture that. It has been so dramatic. If you think of a person of my age, right? About 25, sorry, so in my 50s. And so they would have some memory of the Cultural Revolution, a little bit. And then, you know, they would have a memory of the sort of changes since then. That's a very different world. I mean, the worlds that we remember from childhood to now, I kind of not so dramatically different. In fact, in Britain, they're really amazingly the same. And so it's kind of very striking to kind of work out how people in these landscapes and societies of such huge change really kind of catch on to something that orientates themselves. And I think that's very, very hard for an outsider to properly evaluate and understand. I mean, intellectually you can understand it, but emotionally, yeah, it's really difficult, if at all, if not impossible.
So if we think a little bit more about that kind of outsider side, as it were, I think you would agree with me that compared to many of the times that you engage with in your book, today we find ourselves in a rather more sharp social climate, shall we say, here in the UK, with kind of growing, perhaps, suspicion or hostility towards China. And it made me curious about how you find yourself positioned as somebody who is interested in China, who engages with China, and how that's changed over that period of time. So do you find yourself having to justify being interested in China? And if so, how do you deal with that?
Well, yeah, it has. Do you find that? I mean, I'd be interested in your perspective in a minute, so I haven't let you off completely. But yeah, I mean, it's become much more difficult. In the past, as I think we were saying last night, you know, it would be kind of nice if people took more notice of this very important geography and place, China, and in Britain. And, you know, I was always sort of saying we should get people more involved. And now I'm really nostalgic for that time because, of course, all sorts of people have suddenly acquired opinions about this place. And some of them have never even been there. And I think that matters. I mean, I think that does matter, that you've actually gone somewhere and experienced it. And there's a little more complexity about what you might think. You know, it's easy to have all sorts of assumptions about places which probably have a complicated, you know, kind of image for British people in particular, Americans, I mean, wherever you happen to be. But the lived experience does give you all sorts of pauses for thought. And I mean, I know maybe some Chinese students here, you know, you kind of must be really interesting to sort of, you know, think about how you make sense of the debate about China in the UK. I mean, it sort of must be quite baffling sometimes. Because the place that people talk about is often not really got any kind of bearing or kind of relationship to the place that certainly I've been to, or maybe you've been to. So I think this is going to not go away. Now people have awoken to this place and its importance. The pandemic has obviously brought issues in China much, much closer. That is going to be a constant battle that sort of you have to some point justify why you're trying to explain maybe what Chinese politics is, without sounding like you're you know, kind of validating it. And you know, issues like Hong Kong and Xinjiang and of course Taiwan, it's very difficult because on the one hand, of course, they're extremely confronting and no one would, you know, kind of try and say that these are positive or good things, but on the other hand, they're really complicated and they can't just be dealt with by saying that this is wrong, because of course there are all sorts of complicated issues about different concepts of security and stability and all the rest of it, which can't just be dismissed. It gets really tricky though if you're thinking, okay, as an academic commentator, do you want to have some impact? You know, you can stand apart from it, and some do, and I'm completely respectful of that, and say, I'm just going to do my stuff and not get involved in this public debate. But I think actually it's difficult to not want to have some kind of impact. And once you do have to then get ready to sort of deal with these very complicated issues with a vocabulary that doesn't sound like you're sort of just, you know, an appeaser, that you're also not kind of condemning things out of hand just because you feel like you ought to. You're trying to give an appreciation of how complicated these issues are.
Thank you. So if we get onto some of the more kind of concrete issues then that I thought we might reflect on in light of your book, or that I started reflecting on in light of your book, had to do with, you know, we're here on the eve of COP26. We're in China Week that is themed on the environment and so on. And I came to reflect on them, especially in light of some of the really lovely portrayals that you have, or the little vignettes that you write about your own experience of engaging with nature in China through things like going to parks, for example, or to the countryside, or indeed scaling the Great Wall. And as somebody who has often been to the kind of places that you mention in your book, I found that you and I often found the same kind of experiences evocative. So I also can really relate to the kind of the thrilling sense of joy of being alone on the Great Wall and looking out over the landscape and just the sheer beauty of it, or the tranquility of sitting by a lake at the Summer Palace, for example, and the lovely breeze that comes across it. So that was really lovely to read. And you suggest that the gardens in particular are considered by you as a space of kind of human control of nature, and indicative of culturally embedded ideas about harmonious or good governance. And I was wondering if you see any of this kind of these ideas of good governance that you experience, governance of nature and human control of nature, expressed in the discussions and the attitudes that are on the table going into COP by China.
Yeah, I mean, in the last 25 years, I guess if you've lived in China, you're aware the environment is a constant sort of presence. In the mid-90s in Ho-Hot, I mean, the smogs were really dramatic, actually kind of as bad as they were in the early 2010s in Beijing. You know, some of you may have been in Beijing then, where you could barely see buildings opposite the one you were in. And I think it's important that, you know, the Chinese government and Chinese people obviously have become much more sensitive and anxious about the state of their environment. Whether they're going to be able to solve those problems easily, I mean, it's not going to be easy, but I think it's a really, really important place of common global discourse. And whatever happens next week, so we're obviously talking about this week and these series of events, it would be a tragedy if the sort of current local, and by local I mean global politics, but at this moment in this time, if those were to you know, kind of basically delay or even stop, you know, a significant international effort. I think it's, you know, it's just really impressive that there is a consensus, but there's not a consensus about what to do maybe, but there is a consensus that this is a fundamental problem. So, I mean, that's a big step. I mean, the Chinese landscape is very diverse and impressive, but the role that humans have played in that landscape is perpetually intriguing and sometimes worrying. So when you look at these very beautiful gardens, there's sort of so much artifice, you know, and so there you are basking in the great natural world. And then you're thinking of the human cost of creating these. You talked about the Summer Palace. I mean, the old Summer Palace is a very striking sort of monument because of the way in which, as a British person going there, you can appreciate its quietness and stillness. It's usually very, very quiet and still because it's so huge. But of course, at the heart of it is the sort of ruins which were sacked by the British in the 19th century. And so you can look at them and think, wow, this is really moving. And you can also think, wow, this is quite terrifying. This is what colonization meant, it's a sort of quite a conflicted moment. But I think it's pretty clear. Most Chinese people want a clean, decent environment, and that is pretty similar to what Europeans want. So we just have to be optimistic, even if it's going to take a while to sort the political deal out. Whether it'll happen next week, who knows?
But there's a passage in the chapter on Beijing where you muse on the meaning and the concept of harmony, 和谐. Where you tie it to the belief in things being aligned between the natural and the human in a way that was truthful and real. And you go on to say that if you worked out the language game around harmony in Chinese, you were well on your way to gaining a deeper entry and insight into almost every aspect of the Chinese world around you. You could, as it were, build a whole world up from this one term. Now, as somebody who's written a whole book about harmony and tried to unpack the politics of that language game, I was really curious if, again, you could comment on this idea of harmony in relation to Chinese engagement with COP or lack thereof, indeed. So can a working out of harmony give us a deeper entry and insight into Chinese climate politics? And if so, what can this idea of harmony tell us in this case?
Well, ideally, yeah. I mean, the word harmony, as you commented earlier, is one of the sort of few where Chinese and non-Chinese maybe kind of have a happy, sort of, kind of they're more in agreement. Harmony is a good thing, right? I suppose, but probably one of the problems is that harmony has been used so heavily in politics in China. So it's become this sort of kind of a very ambiguous thing of imposed harmony. So can you have an imposed harmony, an ordered harmony? I suppose you can, but that's sort of quite a strange idea, isn't it? I mean, you're harmonious, but you're not particularly happy about it. Mm. If you're happy and harmonious, put up your hands, right? Well, you can if your hands aren't bound. Mm. So, I mean, I guess, well, a good outcome would be that actually in the next week, there'll be that kind of, moment when everyone sort of just, after arguing and disagreeing and being disharmonious, maybe through exhaustion or pragmatism or just public pressure or whatever, reaches a sort of a moment of or a place of consensus and balance. I mean, that's what international agreements usually end up being. The problem, I suppose, is that because, even though it is a good thing to be harmonious for sure, Chinese harmony is not embraced, rightly or wrongly. And that's because of all sorts of issues. They're not all China's fault. Some of them are China's fault. But if anything scappers it, that will probably be the big contributing factor, that there won't be trust to say, okay, this place of balance we all agree is good for us all. Some will put their hand up and say, no, we're being bounced into this because you get more out of it than we do. If that happens, of course, that would be really disappointing, but it's perfectly possible.
We'll shortly open up to questions from the audience, so get those ready, everybody. But before we do, I wanted to give you a last question, which is, we'll of course all read your book in different ways and get different things out of it, and different vignettes from your book will resonate with different people. But is there anything that you're hoping that people will take from the book? Any inspiration or message or learning that you think, oh, here's something that I hope people will take with them, if anything?
well, I hope they buy it. so it's rather me taking from you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the sort of one of the great pleasures of engaging with China as someone outside of China is this creating of a new story, new possibilities, which were never that possible in before going to this place. And I think Simon Lay's, the Pierre Riekman, wasn't he, the sinologist who was originally from Belgium, but then lived in Australia and died 3 or 4 years ago. He said that any encounter with another place is always going to change you. And I thought a lot in the lockdown about, you know, in the last 18 months about this memory, which I'm sure a lot of you have had who haven't traveled at all, of that person who used to do funky things like get on planes and go places that weren't, you know, within 100 yards of, you know, one's own house. And well, you know, how weird it is that, you know, like there's this kind of life until a particular moment. And then of course you're just focusing on quite a sort of restrained, you know, kind of physically, you're in one place and that's it. You can't leave it very easily. I mean, and that made me kind of think that maybe it I wouldn't say, does it go that deep really? I mean, it's incredible how those memories fade. So I kind of wonder whether if I'd have written this now, I really wonder about how deep it goes, because I kind of think you can say as a person in the past, you had those experiences, but did they really change the way you look at the world? And I think there are some things that probably it's true that they did, but they are incredibly subtle and complicated and integrated in what you think anyway. So it's very hard to pin them down. You can have a set of memories about a place that is different to the one that you knew, you know, you were born and brought up with, and they can be held at a distance from you and can be quite easily discarded. But what really kind of comes closer, and that's something I suppose everyone, you know, all of us need to reflect on, because the kind of real question about what China is today is that it's not a case of having this place out there that we can kind of look at from time to time and then, you know, do our thing. It's come right into where we are. It's now part of us. And I think that's a much more difficult experience to deal with. That's not easy even for someone who was, you know, trying to do this for many years, as you have been. For people who've not prepared at all, that's a big thing to ask. And I don't know, well, this is just an attempt to start thinking about that, but that's not an easy thing to sort out in quite a long length of time rather than just a short period, which is what we've got.
Well, thank you. We also have a short period for some questions from the audience. So I'll take audience questions one by one. So if we start with lady at the back.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Professor Brown. My name is Serena Sauler. I'm from Liverpool today, traveling this morning to attend this book launch. I'm a member of Liverpool-China Partnership, and you probably would recall your work, collaboration with the Liverpool-China Partnership years ago. Liverpool is an amazing city and always has a strong link with China, sister city with Shanghai. And we have been awarded the free port, 8 cities, free port cities in the UK this year in March, and recently opened up a direct shipping service from Liverpool to Ningbo, Shanghai. So it's a fascinating place. There's a huge hunger to learn.
Sorry.
Yes, to learn. My question is coming very soon. To learn all about China. So my hometown, though, is 1,000 miles away from Liverpool. I am from Huahao, China. 我是呼和浩特市人, and also I am a Mongolian, Chinese Mongolian. So I have, I was drawn to come to this this meeting because the title saying from Huahao to Hong Kong. Nobody knows my hometown in academic or business relationship apart from the dairy industry, Mengniu, Yili, etc. And I read the books about the Belt and Road, Silk Road by Peter Franko's Pan. So this is a horizontal shape. I'm fascinated to learn this vertical line in your book from Huahao to Hong Kong. And did you think about when you write this book, it's because your experience, a previous experience living in these cities, or did you think from a different angle to approach rather than this Belt and Road, Silk Road, or a different way?
I'm happy to say. I'm happy to say I did not think of the Belt and Road once. But of course, that's not to say the Belt and Road isn't an excellent idea, but I didn't think of it. The reason, you know, for Huahao is because I was sent there in the mid 1990s. So it was an accident. It was a total accident. And because I worked for an organization, voluntary service overseas, which I think still exists. I mean, it's like the American Peace Corps. And they just sent me there. And I didn't even know it was part of China. And so, but of course, some people would argue passionately that Hong Kong is not a Chinese city. And I did write a piece quite a while ago, about the three great cities of modern China, I think, are Beijing, Hong Kong, and Taipei. And I got roasted by some wonderful people on the internet, and for valid reasons. I mean, maybe they weren't very temperate in their language, but I mean, you know, Taipei is a Taiwanese city. I mean, that's as far as I'll take that one. Hong Kong is a very different kind of place. But they're all dramatic places. I mean, Shanghai is also tremendously dramatic. Xi'an is, because of its history, tremendously dramatic. Beijing, I don't know. It's an easy place to know about and a hard one to find any affection for. But I think that's because, you know, of its modern political role, but there's an enormous human history in that city that you get to know a little bit. I hope I got to know a little bit. So I think that's why these five places, accidentally, but also through just being more and more familiar with them, kind of told me a story about what the whole of China is today. There are many other places you could mention, many other places, but I felt these ones were the ones that I was most confident about.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We had a question here from the gentleman on the right. The microphone will come down in a minute.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Brown. So thanks for sharing. So I'm Jason, and I'm from Southern China. So my question is, in recent 10 years, the central government has implemented the poverty alleviation all around the China. So from the internet, I saw that you have some research on that. So hopefully I'm correct, because I think maybe there's a lot of fake news on the internet. But I would like to hear your point of view on the poverty alleviation on China. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I've written about it. That doesn't mean I've researched it. So this is like an academics sort of Academics Anonymous, isn't it? This is where we confess, you know. So the thing you're probably referring to is the announcement that poverty had been eradicated, which was very dramatic. I think it was made earlier this year, wasn't it, at the National People's Congress? And I'm just interested in what that means to eradicate poverty. For sure, I mean, the measure is, I think from the UN, isn't it, which is $2, under $2 a day. I think in China it's defined slightly differently. And to achieve that is obviously significant. But I was also at that time really interested by the very fierce debate about, you know, what that meant. So by some academics, mostly outside China, maybe inside, but I didn't pay as much attention to that, who really felt this was a meaningless statement. And what did it mean? All you can say, though, is that clearly, whether through government action or something else, the sorts of extensive poverty that even I saw in the 90s and 2000s, it's not something you see now. I mean, maybe I'm not going to the right place, but I don't see that. You see, though, maybe a more complex problem, which is, relative poverty. So not absolute poverty, but relative poverty. And people who might have quite a lot, but think that they don't have as much as other people. So I think Chinese society is probably going to be moving into that era where you are not absolutely poor for sure, but you are relatively impoverished compared to those around you. This is the stuff that you do in your PhD, isn't it, Shan? Yeah. Oh no, I've got the wrong student. Sorry. Where's Shan Huan here? Shan Huan here? No. Anyway, one of my PhD students does this. So, no, relative poverty. You know, so. Yeah.
The perils of talking to people wearing masks. Thank you for wearing them.
I do apologise.
We have a question over here.
Thank you. Lola Frost from War Studies, King's College London. I just wanted to go back to your last point, the one you made before the questions, and to reverse it. How do Chinese people feel about the West?
How do Chinese people feel about the West?
Yes, you were talking about it as a kind of mutuality that wasn't sitting very comfortably with Chinese people.
Well, we have many,
or with Westerners.
Right.
You wanted some concept of, or some idea of that.
We have many people here who can answer that for you with way more conviction than me. I feel, boy. Well, look, I'll give you, what do you think about the West? After I've accused you of doing relative poverty, what do you think about the West? Yeah, good or bad? We've given you your answer. I mean, I think it really, it's broadly, it's a question of, I think, knowledge levels. And broadly, I mean, I know there's a big argument you could have about this, but for all sorts of reasons, I'm sure that in China, people have thought about and looked at Europe and America more than probably Europeans and Americans have thought about and looked at China. That might just be because of economic levels. I mean, there was an incentive for Chinese to think hard about European industrialization and American technology and all these things because they wanted to emulate those. So I think there is a knowledge imbalance. And whether, as China becomes more significant as an economic and technological power, the Europeans and Americans duplicate, they do the same thing, is going to be interesting. Because you still get a kind of mindset of, well, China is still catching up. It's still, like in technological deficit and all this sort of, and then a lot of areas that's not true, startlingly not true. And that's very complacent. So I think one thing we could probably learn from Chinese attitudes towards Europeans and Americans is that they did study. Maybe it's not about particularly liking, but they did look hard. And probably also at the politics, they looked hard and drew conclusions which, well, we don't particularly like maybe, but they drew those conclusions after a lot of thought. So that's the only thing I could really say about that.
Great, thank you. We've got a question right at the back.
Hi, thanks for sharing, Professor Brown. Hi, everyone. My name is Nikki. I'm a I'm a student in King's IPE program, like International Political Economy. I was also a journalist before. So I guess I have two questions very quick. The first one, you mentioned you try to be apolitical when writing about China. And but like nowadays, everything in China seems to be increasingly like political. As journalists, I certainly feel like no matter you write about technology, property, or even like online tutoring, it's all have a like political dimension in it. So as a writer writing about China, to what extent can you write about China without touching the political questions? Where do you stop? Okay, I have a second question. Maybe you can answer the first one.
Why don't you ask both at the same time?
Okay. The second question is about like the China research in Europe, because as you mentioned, it probably become more difficult nowadays to do like China research because of the lack of access compared to like maybe 20 years ago or even. So you mentioned a lot of questions in China are very complicated, and if we don't really have proper access, both as a scholar or journalist to China, to what extent can you kind of explain those complicated China issues to the international like readers or like students? Thank you.
I've already forgotten the first one. This is a problem with kind of, as I was sort of.
Can you write non-politically?
Oh, can you write non-politically? That's why I forgot the first one. What is an ex-diplomat with horrible ease? Yeah. I guess, to be honest, most conversations that you probably have socially in China would be to try and not speak politically. I mean, I think we're all very, if you've got any sense, I mean, the last thing, apart from with Beijing taxi drivers, is to talk about politics. With the Beijing taxi drivers, it's impossible not to talk about politics. So I mean, I think that's just a skill. I guess in the 1990s, Hong Kong, I remember having I took a long train journey from Beijing down to Guangdong, Guangzhou, and there was a student, we were talking about Hong Kong, a Chinese student, and I were talking about Hong Kong, and it was 1995, just 2 years before the handover, and, very big arguments. And I remember we kind of, got to this point where she just said, do you know what? Why don't we not talk about this? And we were very happy. For the next 30 hours, we were very happy. And I think, so those experiences mean that you can avoid talking about politics. However, at some point, to avoid talking about politics is also a problem. I mean, this is just not ever going to be about politics because it's about place. But there are all sorts of things where you can think, well, why is the capital Beijing? That's a political issue. Why is Hong Kong the place it is? That's politics. I mean, politics is always there. And I think the best symbol of that is when you go to Chinese cities like Wuhan, actually, or Shanghai, the place of politics is always very hard to get access to. In Ho-Hot, the administrative buildings are in a compound, and you don't go into them easily or willingly. And in Beijing, obviously, it's the Zhongnanhai, which is very hard to get access to. And I think that sort of says a lot about thinking about politics generally. In China, it's an enclosed area, and you go into it, and you've got to be quite careful. On European views of China, is that right? Have I got the second question right? European views of China? Academics and how to.
China study in Europe.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, obviously, we're the best place in Europe, King's, for the study of Chinese, and that's all you need to know on that subject.
Well, and as somebody who's read Kerry's book, I'd like to say that I read the book politically. I think if there's something we've learned from years and generations of feminism, it's that the personal is political. Mm. And I think that the discussions about the sense of self, of ways of relating between self and other, about harmony and Chinese traditions of thoughts is very political, but perhaps not in terms of the governance that goes on formally. So I think if you're interested in politics, you might also get something from reading this book in that kind of way.
Matthew.
Yeah.
There's a microphone there for you if you like.
Hi, Matthew Astrid from Cavendish. But I'd be very interested if you've got any wise words for perhaps those of us from the business community who've been living a life of 150 visits to Beijing and living there for 2 years, having sort of poured our souls into this for 20 years. Suddenly we're in this entirely different environment. I'm talking about within Europe, not within China. And as you talk about how you out there in your academic area, reflecting on how you have to find this language to be able to communicate in the correct space, where do you think that leaves business, particularly European businesses who are trading more with China and will continue to trade more with China? How do you think they approach the environment within Europe, particularly perhaps the relevance if you think of something like COP, where businesses are being forced to have a position and that's being squeezed out of them. So how do you think businesses in Europe navigate this environment where, 2 years ago, you couldn't stop a prime minister coming to your event. Now you're sort of trying to find your way through this new reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's become much more difficult for businesses to sort of, they're asked to justify what they're doing in China, which is strange because it used to be just doing business was its own justification if it was not about particularly sensitive sectors or in particularly sensitive areas. Look, I think you've just got to accept there's going to be very critical voices. They're not going to go away. But also that I think the economics is going to determine the geopolitics. And we're heading into a deeply uncertain economic period where all sorts of things are going to change. And I don't see how politically you can refuse to, I don't see how, if you politically refuse to deal with a place like China, you can then in your own environment in Europe say, okay, we'll take the economic cost of that. Because there will be an economic cost. And you can certainly rhetorically, you can come out with all sorts of big, bold words about, yeah, we're going to be tough on this place. But as you know better than me, good luck with that. I think China is very aware that its emerging middle class is a huge economic asset. And if that is giving economic growth to others, then I think that will make it much more difficult for some of these critics. Some of them they're making valid points, but it's difficult to turn away from those opportunities when they're bringing benefits which are fundamental to your societies. So I think businesses are going to have to recognize that complexity, but also that no one, apart from those on the absolute extreme, are saying that we shouldn't engage. There are some on the extreme who are saying that, but, I don't think that they are the consensus. So I think carry on the good fight.
Thank you. We've got time for one last question from the audience, I think maybe from a gentleman back here. And then the rest of you will have to just keep your wonderful questions to Kerry. You can all mob him afterwards.
Hi, thank you. When you talked about getting to know a place emotionally instead of intellectually, I was thinking what the role of language plays in all this. Because, for example, I was thinking in the English language, we say the first name before the last name, whereas in Chinese, it's the opposite. It's the last name first and then the first name. And that goes the same for addresses, like addresses for locations. In English, we start with room, and then London at the end. But in Chinese, it's the other way around. It's the collective first. So I think the language itself already plays a role in this kind of collectivist kind of thinking in the East versus the very individualistic thinking we have in the West. And I'm thinking, when we get to know this place, study this place on an intellectual basis, we do that via the language.
in which case this is English. So in a way, I feel like it inhibits our ability to actually know a foreign place if we don't get to learn that place through its own language.
Well, yeah, I mean, so it's a layer of appreciation, of understanding. I mean, I wouldn't say you can't appreciate many things in going to a place like China if you're from Britain. I mean, there's many things that you can appreciate without any kind of language ability. And actually in Huahaota, it's interesting because, or in Hong Kong, there's not just Mandarin, there's other languages, which I can't speak Cantonese, and I can't really say much in Mongolian, unless it's about drinking, where I can say quite a bit. So those kinds of, sort of extra layers are useful. I mean, yeah, we're academics who really think to speak the language of a place. I think that is very, very important. But I don't think it's absolutely, you can get a lot from just going there without those languages. I mean, finally on the cultural issues, when I first went to Huahaota in the winter of 1994, and I remember a sort of guy made friends with me. He was the foreign friend. I remember everyone said, do you know let's call him Mr. Wang, okay? Do you know Mr. Wang? He's the friend of all foreigners. I always saw this guy, the friend of all foreigners. God, we need him now, don't we? And anyway, he befriended various foreigners who'd come to the city. Anyway, the first time we met, I remember he sat me down and said, we have a custom. Whoever has money on them pays for dinner. I tell you, for 10 weeks, that guy never had any money on him. And after that, I mean, like, not dissimilar to, the royal family. So I kind of, at the end of it, sort of thought, this is a really strange custom. What happens, when we don't both have money? We tried it. And yeah, we had to do a lot of sweet talking to the police, but we know, we kind of, we learned about each other's customs that way. So I'm not so sure sometimes you should listen to these things about local customs with a great deal of, without some skepticism. So the punchline, I suppose, is to always be skeptical, but, to realize that sometimes difference is difference. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. And those who have money on them will now have a chance to buy Kerry's book. That will happen in the room next door.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much.
However, the drinks are on the house and will be served at the back. For those of you who have more questions, you're welcome to chat to Kerry about them over a drink, I'm sure. And I'd also like to encourage you to come along to some of our other China Week events. Tomorrow we've got 3 webinars lined up, one on China and understanding the health impacts of climate change, one on digital environmental activism in China, and one on the B3W and the BRI. So maybe you don't get away from the BRI entirely. So please help yourself to a drink, go buy the book and have a chat. Have a really nice evening.
Thank you.